So Ruchi, I've just sent you a message on the chat. Have a look at it.
Okay, see.
Mangalam, you're looking very stern.
You know, as one ages, our eyes, our joints, you know, they strain us, and I think the strain gets reflected on the face, right? And looking, you know, on the laptop screen for long hours, which I have never done earlier, done in the past 6 months, has really, you know, sometimes, as you say, I just like to look at the wall and speak because I can't put up with so much of black.
You know, my sister, Mangalam, who's an eye specialist, she in fact says that after every 45 minutes to an hour, one should, move once, blink a couple of times, look elsewhere, look at something green. She says it has to become a habit. Otherwise, it will lead to an increase in power and so on. So she sent us an entire list of do's and don'ts because I requested her to do that because I'm very concerned about the teachers and the students, you know, the fact that there's so many hours of looking at the screen. So she's given a whole lot of pointers. What I will do is I will send it to you also. Maybe you can share it with your students and colleagues.
Yeah.
They're very good pointers, actually.
Okay, right. I know we have been told to blink our eyes and take a breather, but then we have this 60 minutes class. Sometimes I have 3 lectures in a row. And one feels so, you know, committed to students, one can't, you know, call it quits earlier.
I know. So, but still you will, you know, need to take care. Otherwise, you know, the eyes get tired, one gets a headache. Really quite painful.
Ma'am, may we begin now? If
that's
okay. All right. Okay, Ritigya, I will request you to take over, please. And I'm going to stop the share as of now.
Yes, ma'am, sure. A very warm good morning to all. My name is Ritigya Malik, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today on behalf of the English Department of Janki Devi Memorial College. Before we delve into the world of history and literature, I would like to invite our principal and patron, Professor Swati Pal, to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Pratigya. Of course, to begin with, it is my privilege and pleasure to welcome the speaker for today, that is Mangalam, who is also a very dear friend and a person for whom I have absolute admiration, as she is aware of. So I'm really looking forward, like the audience, to listening to you today, Mangalam, about a subject which is very exciting to me, because I think that it comes at a time when the world is in a certain state of flux and turmoil, and the 17th century, not just in England, but across the world, was once such a period of tremendous political and social upheaval. But what is most fascinating especially in the light of the events over the last week, is Milton. And the fact that Milton was actually somebody who wrote about censorship. He wrote about freedom of speech. And a lot of that arose from the resistance that came to his tracts on divorce writing, which he had, which were kind of looked askance at, and he got into a lot of flack because of those writings. So for me, Milton has always been this towering personality, extremely erudite, extremely brilliant, and a person who responded through his writing to not just the events of the world, but also to the events of his life. And, he made such a public proclamation and declaration of those events in so many varied ways. So he's a person for whom, again, I have a whole lot of curiosity and admiration. I said at the beginning that the 17th century means that I am a student for life, because it is an area in which my own knowledge is considerably less than what it is in, say, the 20th century. So like everybody else, I'm looking forward to you, Mangalam. It would be remiss of me to not also congratulate my colleagues in the English department, the English Association in particular, at a time when webinars are abounding. I'm very proud of the fact that our college and our departments are coming up with such quality speakers with such relevant topics. So I congratulate the department for today's webinar, and looking forward to listening to you, Mangalam. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your kind words. No literature is complete without a historical contextualization. History provides a framework for every piece of literature, and therefore, studying it becomes a necessity. Our study of a time period gives us the ability to develop a critical opinion on the piece of work and build a discourse around its relevant themes. John Milton is an indispensable part of the literary canon. Therefore, it becomes more important to read and understand the times in which the poet lived to better understand his work. It is our pleasure to introduce Dr. B. Mangalam as the speaker for today's event. Dr. Mangalam completed her bachelor's and master's in English literature from Delhi University and her doctorate from JNU in 2008. She has a teaching experience of 36 years, in which she has taught both bachelor's and master's students and has taught classes at both North and South Campus. Her specialization lies in Dalit studies, translation studies, Indian classical literature, feminist and post-colonial theory. She has also mentored theatre and music students. She has edited numerous course books of our syllabus, including Milton's Paradise Lost, Book 9 Worldview Edition. She has an extensive credit of editing, translating, and publishing literary works which have been published in national and international journals. With such tremendous experience at her side, we are more than overwhelmed to have her as the first speaker in our foundation lecture series. Let us not spare another moment. We welcome Dr. Mangalam for her lecture on 17th century England and John Milton. The floor is all yours, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, Pragya. And thank you, Professor Swati Pal. I'm so happy to be here at JDM, though only in this format. Four of my sisters, right? Three elder, one younger sisters. They have graduated from Janki Devi College. And when I started teaching in 1985, I also had a stint of teaching at JDM for nearly 6 months. Right, so I'm really happy to be back here, but I'm really missing your lovely gardens, and just meeting in this manner online that is my greatest loss, that I cannot walk through those lovely gardens of Janki Devi College.
Mangalam, we will kidnap you and bring you back to JDM.
So let's all pray that this pandemic comes to a close quite soon, and we are able to interact in person as well. Today, I do feel a little nervous because it's not easy to talk about Milton. It's quite daunting, and yet one cannot but be passionately, look up to him in awe and admiration and love. Uh, with great trepidation, I would like to speak on the 17th century England as primarily the age of Milton. And in terms of, I will try to see how I succeed in trying to explicate. This is a layered challenge to explicate the 17th century in its various, intricacies and complexities, and also Milton's contribution, Milton's interventions in that particular age. I propose to divide my presentation into two major sections. In the first section, I shall look at the broad spectrum of political processes, events that mark the 17th century in England, and then subsequently trace its impact on subsequent movements that have shaped modern polity and dynamics between the state and the subjects. Most notably, the events of 17th century, we might term it the English Revolution, the Puritan Revolution, whichever way we look at it, the 1640s to 1660s. It's a very interesting period. It's a very exciting period, and it holds much hope. It did hold much hope for subsequent revolutions. The American War of Independence, for instance, in 1776, and more importantly, the French Revolution in 1789. Apart from that, I would like to trace, if time permits, the specific aspects of the Indian independence movement in terms of drawing a parallel, not a direct kind of an impact, but certainly very significant parallels in terms of the role of Milton, for instance, during this period, and that of Ambedkar, right, in the 1940s in our own context. Let us see if I manage to do even half of what I have planned. The second part of my presentation, I would look at Milton's interventions on such a matrix between the 1640s and 1660s, but primarily in the domain of prose. So I would be focusing on his prose works, prose writings, not on Paradise Lost, not on his poetry, the other poems that he wrote, and to try to look at the impact of his political discourse through the tracts, through the pamphlets, through the speech writings, most importantly, Areopagitica, which was a speech written but undelivered. It was meant to be delivered to the Parliament of England, but it was never delivered. And I would like to draw towards the latter half of the second part of this presentation to draw a parallel between two major undelivered speeches in history. One is Milton's, 1644 Areopagitica, and the other is 1936 Annihilation of Caste, which Ambedkar wrote primarily to deliver to Jat Pat Tod Mandal, and then he was refused refused that chance and later published. Similarly, Milton also later published. So we are going to draw a kind of a parallel between certain historical circumstances and the kind of responses of two major thinkers who have shaped, the processes historically, socially, and in the world of ideas, right, which have left a lasting impact till our present times. I would like to focus on the notions of liberty as Milton viewed them, both in the private and the public domain, and trace the graph of his engagement with reform, with the notion of reform in the arena of primarily three different domains, but he looked at them as interrelated, and that is very significant to us in our contemporary situation. He looked at reform as much needed in England in the arena of A, the family, B, the church, and C, the state. It's not that he meant the state to be, the last of the three significant aspects which required the reform, but his interventions were interrelated, and he made it very clear that if you do not pay attention to the individual, the family, and and how he relates it to the church and then later to the state, he is one of the earliest of voices which takes up the question of reform and pushes the church as well as the state towards a secular standpoint, towards a secular positionality. So we will be looking at this. I would request Ruchi to share the second slide. It's not a proper PPT. I know many of you would be better at this. I'm just putting down a series of dates so that it's easier for us, for you and for me to kind of have a quick look at it and then, make our responses, make our comments. At any time, I would invite students to share their observations because I'm not really giving you information or knowledge in terms of anything that is not already available in the public domain or perhaps in your classrooms, I'm sure. So we are primarily going to look at the journey, in England, as I said, which had impact in various continents, including us later in the subcontinent. But look at the journey right from Magna Carta to the Glorious Revolution. That's why I put a series of dates. We might not talk about each and every particular event, but certainly this should give us a kind of a easy entry point to look at how the journey from absolutism to constitutional monarchy. It took a long time, but it was almost kind of, inevitable. And though it was inevitable, it was greatly resisted. And Milton paid as much attention to right to dissent as he kind of, emphasized on a right to liberty in various aspects of human life and community life, and in the in the context of the polity as such. So if you look at right from, and I'm going to not talk about the Renaissance or the Reformation because that's a huge, that's a huge area. So if I mentioned the Magna Carta because that's almost seen as a very earliest of a decisive point in history where the monarch was made accountable to the nobles. To us today, it might not mean much because the nobles are still seen as part of the hegemonic power sharing structure, but it was a very important moment in history, the 13th century England, where the monarch was not allowed to function independently of another important structure of power, which rested with the nobility. But the contestation of power, right? The privilege, the groups, the factionalism, it continued unabated, even during the Elizabethan England and subsequently. So by the time we come to James the First, right? The notion of absolutism was once again revived in a very, very almost crude sense, but not unfamiliar to us, for instance, today, in the context of positing the concept of one nation, one king, one place, one king. Obviously, he had Scotland, Ireland in mind, but it was still trying to hegemonize, the idea of the country as just one homogeneous, and also talking about the absolutist power of the king. And so this is the inheritance, this is the legacy that Charles I takes over. And when he ascends the throne, he began to continue this trend towards absolutism, primarily in terms of his his very deliberate disregard of the parliament, right? And he not only disregarded the parliament, he also disregarded the major, I would say, major, I would say, disruptions, almost as a social crisis, as an economic crisis, certainly, died, we are told, either of the plague or famine. There was starvation, pockets of starvation as well. And also there was a continued rural-urban dislocation. These are aspects that, as I said, as Swati also pointed out, are unfortunately familiar to us today as well. The dislocation, the disruptions, the migrancy, the loss of employment, and equally the total unconcern of the ruling hegemonic power. And Charles, of course, did it with elan, and he would call the parliament as and when it suited, especially if he wanted the funding for to finance his wars. Otherwise, he would not pay any attention to parliament. So the systematic marginalization, right, the disregarding or the disregard towards institutions, started around this time. And he also taxed heavily, and the taxation, which was pretty heavy, was unapproved by the parliament. And this was naturally, to be resented. The resenting and the dissenting groups make a very interesting reading for us today. It was a motley group from today's standard. It was not primarily the Puritans, but also other radical factions, especially the levelers, then followed by the diggers. I'll just briefly explain. And also, primarily in terms of, the middle class, the new middle class, the burghers. From that we get the bourgeoisie, of course, and tradesmen, the yeomen, the petty merchants and artisans. So, the dissenting voices emerged from all these social formations. And so therefore, we might not see a very cohesive pattern of opposition, but it was interesting to notice that this all emerged from different pockets of the community, different pockets of the people as such, which was unexpected. And since the legacy of absolutism never prepared Charles to anticipate that this will, move towards a very well-shaped movement. And in this aspect, the levelers, for instance, demanded a kind of, equal rights for all sections of the society. They also demanded that voting rights should be extended beyond those who owned property or other kinds of financial, entitlements. So these were certainly new ideas. So this entire period has to be seen not just as a kind of a political dissent, which it was certainly, and very valuable one, but also in terms of in terms of reconfiguring certain perspectives, right? And that involved the perspectives pertaining to the dynamics between the ruler and the ruled, right? So this is that political domain that we will again and again come back to that. But the crisis in the social and the health sector and the job sector, and the impact of those aspects on the nature of governance, right? On the nature of the legitimacy of governance. So this is the new equation that emerged, and which altered the relationship between monarchy, parliament, and the public. Now, the church, factions of the church, then the dissenting factions, I mentioned the levelers and the diggers. The diggers began to call themselves the new levelers. They were more radical than the levelers and their demands for equal rights, political rights. But then the diggers did something very remarkable. Right? They were sometimes being called anarchists by subsequent, I would say, ages, but I don't think that they can be called anarchists. What the diggers did was interesting because they actually took over, the lands that have been, devised under the Enclosure Act, and started cultivating, started planting vegetables, started planting crops, primarily food crops. And this was their way to draw the attention towards the famine and the starvation and the migrant population absolutely starved in the London city. This was a very important intervention, which was a kind of a public activist intervention, which was remarkably innovative as well as something not experienced before in history. So they were called diggers because they actually started digging up land, right, and cultivating, and as I said, cultivating primarily food crops. So this was a serious challenge that had to be responded to, but Charles, in his own way, responded only in terms of summoning the parliament and then dismissing them, and not calling the parliament at all for any kind of consultation. There was writing. There was a series of rebellions reported from Scotland, from Ireland. So it was certainly getting very pretty, hot for Charles. So the lobby of the merchants, the gentry, the Puritans, the burghs, and the artisans, tradesmen, etc., they all kind of became a kind of a group of interest groups, as we would call them today. The lobbying that they did was very, very significant, and it could no longer be ignored. And we also need to see that the Reformation had kind of enabled the public to understand that the ecclesiastical hierarchy is open to a critiquing. So this kind of a critique of hierarchy in the ecclesiastical order found a shift in its base when it began to target its critique towards the hierarchy in the social matrix and in the political matrix. So what I'm arguing is that from the Reformation to the English Revolution, we see the major shift in terms of a process changing its locale, right? Changing its emphasis in terms of the church authority to the temporal, to the political authority. So therefore, primarily the English Revolution or the 1640s has to be seen in terms of challenging, offering a challenge to the hegemonic hierarchical power structure. Right? So certainly this was seen as very, very disruptive. So the process of erosion of power that I'm trying to draw our attention to from the Roman Catholic Church, that erosion of power, which was formalized during the Reformation, now began to be shifted, as I said, to the hegemony of temporal power and the challenge that this domain received from multiple social groups demanding a decentralization of power. It began as a demand for decentralization, involve the parliament, involve, the voices, and the merchants were difficult to be put down. They began to demand that the ship tax has to be rolled back. Right? So even though they could not enter the parliament, even from outside the parliament, the merchants put a lot of pressure and, in terms of a demand, as I said, to decentralize and to question the concentration of power in the hands of the monarch. And subsequently, and almost imperceptibly, this demand shifted to a demand for share in power. So this is, again, a very interesting part of the graph. So the processes unleashed in the 17th century England, right? So ultimately, it also had its impact. As you can see, the dates, Archbishop Laud was impeached because he had declared his own prayer book, and that was objected to by the Puritans, and he was close to Charles. So attacking or impeaching the archbishop was another way of warning the monarch as well, which again it was ignored by Charles. So if you look at the processes, the questioning of the church and its hegemony, right? And secondly, the questioning of the monarchy. The questioning of the monarchy was a little muted, but the what should I say, the realization that the church required larger, scope of reform was repeatedly, I would say, conveyed, demanded, not only by the Puritans, but also other radical factions of the Protestant church. So Reformation was not enough. You needed greater reforms, and it also included the certain matters pertaining to the individual, pertaining to the family, also needed to be taken out of the ecclesiastical framework and brought to the domain of civil, relations. So we will look at it a little more closely, but the Civil War, right, 1642 to 45, minor respite, and then again in 1648, has to be seen more in terms of a reflection of what I just try to, very quickly trace the processes, right? The movements, they cannot be seen only as events. Though I have put them down in terms of specific dates and year, etc. We cannot associate only in terms, these are important milestones, right, in the process. The historical process of the voices of the oppressed, voices of the, disempowered, and how they join hands. And it is interesting to note that it does not matter that they sometimes had very, differing kind of ideology or convictions, but they joined hands. And that is not to suggest again that they joined hands only to bring down the monarch. It was not so. They had different kinds of demands. For instance, the demands made by the merchants was vastly different from the demands made by the diggers, right, or by the tradesmen, or by the emerging middle class. They were different, but they all kind of, as I said, converged on this particular point in terms of demanding diversification, right? Demanding decentralization of one, a major source of power. Right? So the beginnings of the modern period, right, in terms of its emphasis on liberty of the individual, and in terms of non-interfering governance, right? It begins in this era, and this culminates only, it begins with, if you notice, the Petition of Right in 1628, which was submitted by the Parliament to Charles, and which he never granted. But it kind of culminates with the Bill of Rights in 1688, which we call the Glorious Revolution. But from 1628 to 1688, these 6 decades, England went through a great period of turmoil. And this turmoil cannot be localized only to the Civil War. That is most obvious, right? And that's most crucial, yes. But what interests me more is that the underlying causes, the underlying reasons, the underlying demands, right, which propelled a civil war. Right? That had a far-lasting impact in subsequent ages and inspired more powerful revolutions. And as I mentioned earlier, the American War of Independence, the French Revolution, the anti-caste movements in India. So all these can be traced back to this questioning of the hegemonic structure. Right, and the restoration happened much later. We will perhaps not go right up to that, though I did mention the Glorious Revolution, which comes later. So as I said, we have to look at this entire period, as a long period of over 60 years in terms of continuities, disruptions, but again, inevitable movement forward. to its logical conclusion of the Bill of Rights, which said that the monarch cannot sign any bill without being approved, without consulting the parliament. So therefore, the supremacy of the parliament, right? It takes more than 6 to 7 decades, but the process begins right from, I would say, James I. His endeavor towards absolutism actually begins the last nail, so to say. It took a lot of time. It was a rusty nail, so it took a lot more time and a lot more sacrifices, a lot more suffering. These figures are staggering, right? More than 40,000 people in over 10 years time, and through various owing to different various causes. So the takeaway from the Civil War, right, was not only the protectorate, was not only Cromwellian regime. Milton had issues with that as well later. Again, on the question of the governed and the governing. Again, in terms of the individual liberty vis-a-vis state's intrusion, but primarily the takeaway from the 1640s and 17th century, mid 17th century English English period is, I would say, one reconfiguration of structures of power, which pushed to relook, to reconfigure, to reformulate the relationship between the ruler and the subjects. Right? So when Charles I was executed, it came as a huge, I would say, huge shock, not just in England, but throughout Europe, because it had never not happened, right, in recent history, and it came as a huge shock. But to us, looking back, it comes as a major takeaway that the structures of power was interrogated, was questioned, was reformulated, on the part of the public, on the part of a huge group of a very wide spectrum of groups and social formations. Secondly, another takeaway is the rise of the mercantile class. Not just the army or the nobility, but a new mercantile class, the trading interests, and little later around this period, we already have the trade relations as the major source of wealth for England. Right, so the kind of very embryonic, I would say, expansion through the mercantile endeavors had begun again in the 17th century. So while this century is very inspiring to us, right, it also is a germinating, I would say, time to expand towards expansionism, towards mercantile, expansionism, and through that consolidating the political power, which happened in the next 3 decades or so. It began to be more visible in that period, but it was happening right at this time. Then thirdly, this is closer to understanding Milton's role as well, the rise of a professional middle class. This again happened during the 1640s to 1660s as a very dominant, emerging, and a very sustained voice, not only against the monarchy, not only against the structures of hegemonic power, but also in terms of offering a new conceptualization of how to look at the dynamics of relationships, interpersonal and intra-groups, as well as I said earlier, between the state and the individual, between the state and the community. So reform, though we call it the English Revolution, if you notice closely, what emerges is a series of reforms. Yes, the Civil War happened. Yes, the king was executed. That was pretty violent and revolutionary radical act. But by the time Charles I was executed, you also had a kind of another process of sympathy pouring forth for the king, because the way he conducted during the execution, right, it really won sympathizers, a substantial segment of sympathizers to his fold. So the royalists did not completely kind of, what should I say, bow down, right? So therefore, we cannot immediately glorify or valorize this period as revolutionary and radical, etc. It was a slow, but as I said, you cannot wish it away, right? Inevitable process of demand for reforms. And the fact that the demand came through interrogation, the demand came through voicing dissent, the demand came through a community representation, right? Those are interesting and enabling for us. But yes, ultimately it culminates in the Glorious Revolution, and also the Commonwealth lasted only for less than 10 years, so to say. 1649 to 53, the Commonwealth, and then the Protectorate. Cromwell declared himself as a protector, 1653 to 58, and then his son took over up to 60. So we have those 10 to 12 years of non-monarchical rule, but it was also equally a period of turmoil. So the stability that we associate with a new visionary revolutionary movement did not happen, because this is important to at least I would say make it, keep it on record, that they were actually the demand for Charles's head was pretty radical. Maybe they didn't even plan it, right? But it happened primarily because he just did not listen to them at all. Had he compromised, we would have had the Glorious Revolution perhaps earlier. So what I'm trying to argue is that this needs to be seen not the way we look at the French Revolution, right? But more in terms of a groundbreaking series of processes, working on reforms, working on radical reforms, but reform primarily, right? And overthrowing of the king, and then going back and restoring the king, right? And then what follows is a very, very different trajectory on the cultural and the political map. Milton, for instance, wrote his Paris Laws, technically speaking, during the Restoration, right? 1667 to 74. But we never refer to his work as Restoration work, isn't it? Because he is primarily the 17th century poet in terms of, and when we talk about 17th century, we have the 1640s to 1660s, right? Primarily as our what should I say, focus. I'm getting lots of pop-ups here. Just a moment, I'll close this. Yeah. So the reforms were also conducted. This is interesting. It was a period of reform demanded, right, and granted, but the reforms were also focusing in terms of a very holistic nature. It was a holistic way of looking at reforms in the political, social, community domain. Not just, it can't be seen just as an execution or as a political coup, but the demand for structural changes, right? So that takes time, and it's easier to revolt and have a very violent revolution, but then come back to a kind of a regressive period as well. So this is creditable to the English Revolution, that it is still, we term it revolutionary, primarily because the reforms that it unleashed, the reforms that it demanded were sustained, were granted, and were mediated as well. But certainly it had a much long-lasting impact. And we can also look at it in terms of the Puritan Revolution. The Puritan Revolution, I'm using the term not in terms of looking at it as only as a church faction, as a faction of the Protestant church, but more in terms of the Puritan ethics, right? The emphasis on the individual, whether in terms of the thrift or in terms of the hard work or in terms of their conviction that the Bible has to be negotiated, right, by the individual at the level of the individual oneself. When you transfer this Puritan ethic, right, I mentioned three major aspects. So the thrift and the hard work can pertain to the social and the economic, and the negotiation of the Bible by the individual, again pertaining to pushing for reform of the church and pushing it towards a more secular amenability. When it is transferred, this kind of an ethic, when it is transferred to I would say, start a counter movement, then it pushes itself towards a more civil, a more secular, and a more community-centric movement. Right? So the English Revolution is pushing the state and the church towards a more civil and towards a more secular conceptualization. And we are moving towards that. And the notions of classical liberalism, like individual liberty, challenging of institutional spaces, right? The contestation of privilege versus merit, right? So the notion of the modern welfare state, so to say, not exactly in that sense as we understand today, but pushing the state, right, to drop its own hold on power as self-aggrandizement and more towards recognizing, right, co-opting merit into privileged pockets of power. Right? These began to happen. And no wonder that a few years later, we could have Hobbes's the Leviathan and Locke and Newton and the Royal Society of Science, etc. So all those shaping influences, right? We again see the germ here. So what I'm trying to argue is that the process of moving towards moving towards what we would term a civil and a secular notion of power, right, and structure of governance. That is, I think, the major, what should I say, major accomplishment and major, takeaway for us from the 1640s. I would like to have the next slide, Ruchi. So the first part of my presentation, right, I was focusing on the historical forces, and interestingly, perhaps I didn't remember at that time when I talked about the multiple factions. The diggers and levelers had women preachers as well, right? That was another interesting aspect, and not only women preachers but also men from lesser marginalized groups, less privileged groups, they also began preaching, and they were of course resented. Women preachers were certainly resented. They were looked at with suspicion. There was jingles and jokes about them. There was one which is pretty famous, which says, "When women preach and cobblers pray, the friends of hell make holiday." Right? So they did not like what was happening. That is why I say that it was not a complete overthrow, but very, very significant changes, very, very significant interventions were happening. And so the foundation of a new social vision, and the overthrowing of the feudal structure, almost, very, very, I would say, effectively, at this point, the possibilities of free thought, right? So this has to be seen revolutionary more in terms of in the domain of thought, in the domain of standpoints. And it was inspired by the earlier humanist, humanist period, but the fact that they could overhaul institutionalized spaces of privilege, right, and push them towards a change in perspective, a change in the mindset, a change in their standpoints. That is absolutely remarkable. Now, in the second part of my presentation, Ruchi, do tell me if I'm exceeding my time. We can look at Milton's interventions, and as I said, primarily through his prose. And here again, I just put down the analogous dates, and you can, kind of correlate with the earlier slide in terms of the events that that were, that he was responding to. So I said earlier that Milton's voice is one of the earliest of voices of the public intellectual. And yes, he did have a bad marriage, but we cannot say that his 3 divorce tracts was because of his bad marriage. Yes, his one of his divorce tracts actually gave this more impetus to the Censorship Act, and so he wrote Repigetica. Yes, but we cannot say that he did it only because his tract was probably could be pre-censored. The censorship was actually in terms of, passing through the stationers registered to be, before publication, right? So it's a pre-publication censorship. These are those contextual details, which I'm sure you have discussed in the class. So I don't want to comment much on that. But the fact that Milton here, if you look at it, he is pushing for a reform in church, in family, right? In the context of marriage, and in terms of the individual freedom of expression, of writing, and to be able to talk truth to power and not be put down on that count. To justify the regicide, right? To talk about this one especially. This was published in February 1660, and in May, the end of by 29th May or so, Charles was restored. Right, so that was, I would say, but he did not give up, and I think that is very, very significant also to remember. I will look at some of the tracks in little more detail, but the ready and easy way to establish a free commonwealth he published in February 1660 with great amount of hard work, and exactly 3 months or so by end of May, Charles was restored. So why I'm mentioning this? This is to underline that Milton did not change his position, right? Did not change his conviction. Quite often, when we, the earlier school of critics on Paradise Lost have located a shift in Milton in terms of he was a Republican, right, challenging authority, and now he's talking about submission, obedience, etc. So in that context, I would like to, kind of underline that Milton did not shift his convictions or his standpoints. He might have, even earlier, he had been looking at church reform, right? He had been looking at the need to integrate the social and the political reform and revolutionize thought processes. That was his primary aim. And so therefore, we cannot say that he made a kind of a volte-face, right? He did not. He was arrested briefly, but also notice that the order was for burning of his pamphlets. And that is why I want that when we read Paradise Lost in our university classrooms, because nothing else is prescribed that had been written by Milton, unfortunately, we really need to marshal his prose tracts to look at Paradise Lost as well, to look at Samson Agonistes as well. And throughout his career, again 1640 to 1660, primarily, he focused on, marshalling his prose to debate, to dissent, to argue, and to hold a conversation, right? to hold a conversation, to also to emphasize that conversation is very, very significant and primary, to him, not only within the domain of marriage, but also conversation between monarchy and the public. Right, conversation between parliament and the thinking writer, the writing hand. So the right to debate, the right to sustain a conversation in the political domain and the social domain, and the right to dissent. Right, so these are all constantly marshaled within the premise of the church reforms, as well as the political reform pertaining to parliament and monarchy. So this is a persistent willingness on the part of Milton to let him be, right, to allow himself to remain in a minority position, to remain marginalized come what may, but to abide by his own conviction, to speak truth to power, and he never said that, oh, I regret. He might have ruminated over the events of the Restoration. He might have talked about justifying the ways of God to men, but that was not to be in terms of a kind of, in terms of going back on his convictions concerning the Commonwealth, concerning the decentralization of monarchical absolutism. His ideas of social reform, for instance, in the, can we have the next slide, please? For instance, in terms of how he looked at marriage, he is looking at reform primarily as a process of reconstruction, a reconfiguration of certain established institutions which have almost become fossilized. And one such institution was the marriage, the institution of marriage. So when he wrote the divorce tracts, he became hugely unpopular, even amongst his friends and amongst his own, groups of thinkers who had agreed with him earlier, and they did not want to. So, in the 17th century, marriage was seen primarily as an act of sacrament, as an ecclesiastical. It was placed within the framework of the ecclesiastical power, right? Ecclesiastical domain. Milton is marshalling it out, right, to enter the civil domain, as a contract, as a kind of a relationship between two individuals of different genders, but of equal, right, in terms of their intellectual strength. So he, in fact, he said that if you want to reform the state, right, you need to reform the other institutions first. And he says that true reformation, right, will happen only when such an evil as, as he looked at the present state of marriage in 17th century England, he says, as long as we do not look at it, as long as we do not tweak it, as long as we do not, reorder it, and we do not set our house in order, we cannot really think in terms of reformation in the political, in the state, in the, in the more obvious hegemonic structure. So when he brings in notions of helpmeet, it is borrowed from the Bible, yes, but he kind of elaborates it in terms of looking at the spouse, looking at the wife as primarily an equal partner. Right? And not many, perhaps even today, do not look for a cheerful conversation, right, as a very prime concern in marriage. And Milton, in fact, says that the biological or the sexual aspects of the relationship is not to be insisted upon, but more in terms of whether it can fulfill the need for what he calls a fit and matchable conversation. Just to claim the performance of a fit and matchable conversation as no less essential to the prime scope of marriage than the gift of bodily conjunction, right? So it is not primarily for procreation, it's not primarily for sexual satisfaction or sublimation, but also the need to converse, the need to have a conversation, cheerful, apt, lightsome, right? He used various terms. So this is also then later on reflected, for instance, in the way he explores the relationship between Adam and Eve in books 9 and 10 of Paradise Lost, and even in book 4. He looks at this as a very significant aspect of family as an institution. So he says, if you're not, able to cultivate harmony in family, in the individual life, you cannot really work towards reform, right? Only in terms of, so personal is political. We always quote it in the context of women's lives, but Milton's voice is one of the earliest of voices to grant this to both the genders, right? Personal is political in marriage for both the genders, and it needs to be politicized. It needs to be also marshaled into a kind of an analogous, institution, which is based on hierarchy, which is based on power, and that needs to be regulated. That needs to be reconfigured. Right? So just as we are reconfiguring or we are regulating, we are negotiating the power of the ruling hegemony, he also looks at every structure of power, be it within the family, within marriage, or within church, right? In terms of meriting a regulation, a reconfiguration, and therefore he also looks at very early in church government against prelacy, he says that tyranny has invaded the church. So terms like tyranny, terms like liberty, right? Terms like the need to make it sustainable, right? At every level. And therefore, his argument and his debates pertaining to reform is much more crucial, is much more, I would say, well-sustained than merely calling for, off with your head kind of politics, which he never talked about. He might have justified the regicide, but he wrote it out as a very logically argued tract. Right? And this, again, as I said, is the beginning of revolutionizing the thought process, right? Our perceptions towards certain very crucial institutions which we have taken for granted. And this is the period also that the last I forgot to talk about Areopagitica, my most favorite of his prose tracts. Areopagitica, the context and the background we know. What we need to look at is a couple of quotations very closely from this tract, where he argues, very debates with the parliament, right? It's a very dramatic speech as well. So it sounds like a debate. It reads like a conversation. It reads like and he does use a lot of rhetoric. It uses, he manages to persuade, but alas, it was never delivered. The parliament never cared to listen to him. But in that speech, he says at one point, where there is much desire to learn, there of necessity will be much arguing, much writing, many opinions, for opinion in good men is but knowledge in the making. Now this I find so apt to, decade after decade in our own lives, in our own contemporary society, that there is the need for much arguing. There's a need for much disagreement. And the fact that we need to recognize as many people as we have around us, there would be many opinions. And this is opinion formation. And exchange of opinions has to be seen in terms of knowledge in the making, right? So the very notion of epistemological argument that Milton raises here in terms of looking at engaging with your opponent, right, as a process of knowledge making. Alas, if only we could learn from this and retain this in our own respective dealings with our wherever we get into a kind of a dissenting mode. And he also says that we cannot always agree. If all cannot be of one mind, and he says, as who looks, there should be. Right? So the argument towards plurality, right? Towards multi-vocality, towards a kind of a diverse set of voices, right? Not pushing towards homogeneity, not pushing towards a kind of a neither a monolithic church nor a kind of a univocal voice in the public or in the private domain. So he says it is much more wholesome, much more prudent, and notice he also calls it more Christian. Right? He is using it not in a religious sense, but in a cultural sense, in terms of, if you look at Christianity, in terms of its essential principles of charity, right? And love thy neighbor as thyself, right? In that sense, the communitarian aspect of Christianity, he says it's much more Christian and prudent, right? The fact that he brings in prudence and the notion of being more Christian in spirit in one breath, that again indicates that he is looking at church, as I said earlier, in terms of an institution, right? Not as derived from God directly, but in terms of a man-made institution which needs to accommodate the individual and the community, and that you need to be what he calls that many be tolerated, rather than all compelled. Absolutely, I feel that we should use this as a school prayer, right? Every morning, that many be tolerated rather than all compelled in 1644 makes a very interesting what should I say, proposition. And interesting, I'm saying, because this is absolutely essential, right? That we practice it in every culture. But Milton was talking, about his own times, and things are equally valid, right? In every subsequent age, that many be tolerated rather than all be compelled. But the same person, the same public intellectual, all these years, these 20 years when he was writing in prose, political pamphlets and tracts, etc., he says that I'm wasting my energy. I should be busy writing my epic, which he had formulated much earlier, but he gave greater importance to this, which I feel very sad that we do not give enough importance to his prose tracts in terms of our engagement with Paradise Lost. It's not that he wrote that and he changed and then he started writing the epic and he's a great epic writer. No, this continued, but he halted the process of for writing an epic, primarily because he gave much greater significance, much greater importance to the fact that we need to set our house in order, the house of private institutions, social institutions, right, religious institutions, and ultimately the institution that governs all of us, the state. So this aspect of reconfiguring and reconstruction was much more important, and you can see that a similar graph exists in Paradise Lost as well, when he says that I'm going to write an adventurous song, right? I'm going to do not anyone has done before in English. So he is conscious of that, but more in terms of again reconfiguring the notion of heroism, the notion of the epic hero, the reconfiguring how we look at pagan heroism. So therefore, even his Paradise Lost, the epic has to be seen in terms of a continuation of his earlier engagement that gets reflected in his prose tracts. For instance, he never kind of moves away from his concern with man. Could we have the last slide, Ruchi? Sorry. He never moves away primarily, from his primary concern with man's liberty, right, with man's well-being. And even if he's talking about the church or about God, he says, this is primarily about one man versus another, greater man, right, of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, etc. We are very familiar with these lines, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe with loss of Eden, till one greater man. Right, that is how he looks at Christ, not as an aspect of the Trinity, and that brings us to discuss Christian doctrine briefly before I bring in Ambedkar and Milton. Not as a pet peeve, but in terms of looking at very significant parallels. When he looks at Christ as one greater man, right? So he humanizes Christ, obviously, but around the same period, right, when he was writing Paradise Lost, he had begun writing his most ambitious, his most valued and cherished work, Christian Doctrine. And in fact, he said that he wrote it in Latin, and he said that this is my most ambitious work. In fact, he says, if everything else is lost, but if this is preserved, I would rather be known by this work. But look at the irony, or do we see it as the post-restoration anxiety about censorship, right? And getting into a conflict with the new power structures. The Christian Doctrine was never published during his lifetime. Was it a choice, or were there no takers in the Restoration publishing universe to publish Christian Doctrine? It was also, had it been published, it would have been the most heretical of documents. It was Milton's very well studied personal interpretation of the Bible, with his own typical scholarly, erudite, perspectives and a lot of documentation. But he made a couple of arguments which would have been blasphemy. He said, for instance, Jesus was created by God the Father, so he cannot be co-equal, right? That is a hierarchy. He cannot be co-equal. He also said that there's no evidence concerning the Holy Spirit in the Bible. So he left it at that. So these are certainly, perhaps this also could be a reason why he was not very keen to publish, but though he valued this work even more than he valued his epics and Samson Agonistes, in certain respects. It was discovered only in 1825. Right, and it was translated from Latin to English and published in 1826 by a bishop, ironically. But by that time, by 1826, Paradise Lost itself had been marshaled into a series of orthodoxies, right? And therefore, nobody took Christian doctrine seriously. Whereas the best way to read Paradise Lost would be to look at Christian Doctrine, look at Areopagitica, look at his divorce tracts, look at his church reforms tracts, and then correlate with how he's analyzing, even when he's shifting the structure of authority from the temporal back to the divine authority. The way he looks at the notion of divine authority itself, is equally problematizing the notion of authority, the notion of submission, the notion of obedience. Right. So these need to be done in a sustained manner, not today, but we need to look at how, as I said earlier, overlooking one particular set of writings of a writer. Here we are overlooking two different sets of writings of Milton. One is the prose tracts, the pamphlets written over 20 long years. The other is what he himself considered as his most ambitious, most scholarly, most from the heart and from his from his convictions, Christian Doctrine. We are disregarding these major writings of essentially the 17th century ideological setting and looking at one particular text in isolation, and quite often in isolated, only in book 1 or book 9 or book 5, etc. So we are doing grave injustice to Paradise Lost, to Milton, to 17th century, and also we fail to notice how, thanks to those orthodoxies which managed to project Paradise Lost primarily as a Christian epic, right? When it was introduced in India through the Macaulay Minute on Education, when universities opened up and the Western education was introduced in India, Paradise Lost began to be appropriated in terms of the discourse of obedience, submission to authority. And you can see the politics behind such an orthodoxy, such a reading of Paradise Lost, because it does suit the imperial ruling power to push for submission to authority, to push for obedience to authority amongst its Indian readers through what Macaulay, for instance, believed, that one set of the English and the Western books, one shelf would is fit enough to supplant the entire Persian, Sanskritic, and Arabic, and the other classical languages and literatures. So when you have such imposition of Paradise Lost in the form of an appropriated orthodoxy, right? We need to question how Milton focused much more on the social and the political and the religious reforms, primarily in terms of the well-being, right, of the individual. In fact, in Christian doctrine, he says that I'm not so concerned for religion. I'm quoting Milton. Now, I'm not concerned, I'm concerned not for religion, he says, but for life's well-being. Right? This he says in Christian doctrine. So that is what he was doing, because Paradise Lost and Christian doctrine were almost being written around the same period. And why I brought in Ambedkar was to notice that here is another important intellectual, another important activist writer, who also focused more on social reform. Right? And when he talked about social reform, he looked at the need to reform the Hindu society, the need to reform the religious aspects of a particular society, of a particular community, and then pave the way for political autonomy. At one point, he said that as long as we do not, we do not reform ourselves, on the social spectrum, there's no point. There's no point in, demanding political independence. So, like Milton, Ambedkar also chose to negotiate his ideas and his demand for justice, primarily through his belief in debate, in dialogue, and in agitationist politics, agitation for constitutional rights. Right. So if the English Revolution was trying to supplant absolutism and moving towards constitutional monarchy, in the Indian context, I wanted to draw a parallel in terms of how Ambedkar focuses more in terms of looking at the need for social reform, right, of our society. And he, like Milton, as a Christian, wanted to reform the church. Here, Ambedkar, until 1956, right, though he declared in 1936, I will not die a Hindu, he was still writing as a Hindu. He was arguing and debating as a Hindu the fact that we need to reform the Hindu society. Right. Of course, he was more radical than Milton in terms of demanding an annihilation of caste and not just reform. But this trajectory of, we can stop the slides, Ruchi, thank you. This trajectory of falling back on debate, right, conversation, dialogue, and a series of community propelled agitations, right, for rights. for rights of the individual, for rights of a particular group, and looking at religion in terms of a social construct. So therefore, focusing more on social reform, right, than on, and looking at political reform as an extension. And unless we set our house in order, right? So therefore, whether we look at it in terms of the divorce tracts or in terms of Ambedkar's engagement with the structure of caste, what both the writers across centuries, across the continents, and why I'm linking the two is that one nation ruled over the other, right? So we do have a right to look at the intellectual, negotiation as well across centuries to see how reform, right, can be pretty radical. Reform can be revolutionary, and we have to redefine how we look at the word reform, not as limited revolution, but in terms of pushing for a radical rethinking and reframing of our paradigms. I'll just conclude with what a very celebrated English poet Wordsworth wrote on Milton around the time of French Revolution in 1802. He simply termed it London, but he said, "Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour. England hath need of thee. She's a fen of stagnant waters, altar, sword, and pen." Right? This sonnet is very famous, and we don't have the time. And I think I have already exceeded, and you have been very nice to me, and by not, stopping me in the middle. But this sonnet you must read, Wordsworth's sonnet on, addressed to Milton, where he clearly talks about the altar, sword, and the pen. And these are what I try to draw your attention to in terms of Milton's engagement with the church, with the polity, and with the individual / family community. Thank you. I'll stop here and hope there would be responses.
Thank you, ma'am, for this illuminating session on 17th century and John Milton. Now, we would like to invite all the audience to ask the question. Students can write down their questions and comment in the chat box, or they can unmute themselves and ask their question directly to ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I've sent everyone off to sleep on a Saturday forenoon.
No, ma'am, I think what is probably happening is that because the lecture was so engrossing that people are still just coming back. I think the students are just coming back and trying to now formulate whatever questions they might have. Ma'am, if I may just begin the session, I really found this the parallels between Ambedkar and John Milton that you're drawing over here very interesting. And in fact, I think you shortened it. So if you could just maybe elaborate on it a little bit more, because I found this very interesting. So if you could just elaborate there.
Yeah, that's one of my major engagements. So I didn't want to be drawn into that. Then it was difficult to restrain myself, and it's very unfair to students, going on for a very long hour, more than an hour. I think this particular audience certainly is very familiar with Milton, as well as in the Indian classroom as the present one, we are also aware of Ambedkar. Ambedkar engaged with the Hindu society, with the Hindu structure of power, at various levels, right? We know the Mahad Satyagraha. We also know his temple entry Satyagraha. And and I think the third years, if they are present, they are doing the Untouchable Spring. So I'm sure they are also looking at Annihilation of Caste, the excerpts from that. what I had in mind was that throughout his career, Ambedkar uh, belonged to a persecuted, marginalized, oppressed group. But what he did was to fight not just for his rights, but fight on behalf of the entire community. Again, not his own community, but regarding the entire Indian slash Hindu society at that time. And he repeatedly tried to engage both with Gandhi and with the general public that we need to reform our own society if we need to proceed further, at the global level, or even proceed further to demand our own independence to be able to govern ourselves. This was not acceded to from other sections, other factions. I did talk about factions in the English context as well. So certainly it was not acceded to. It was not even allowed to be, in terms of an engagement as well, because it was not seen as something wrong with the society, but rather we just need, political independence. And like Milton, Ambedkar also emphasized that we need to set our house in order. And unless we have social freedom, unless we have equality at the social and economic, domain, we cannot really think in terms of political freedom or political or equality in the political domain. And therefore, he tried to assert that we need to find our way inside the temple. We are all Hindus, we are all equals. When that was not, acceptable, over a period of time, we realized that the concern should be more in terms of the civic issues, not in terms of the religious issues per se. So visiting the temple as a matter of right for every Hindu, whichever caste one belongs to, is absolutely essential. But Ambedkar began to shift his focus in terms of the civic equilibrium. And so he said our access to water is much more important. So he shifted his movement from the temple to the tank. Right, the discourse around liberty, around freedom, in terms of from temple to tank. So I see a similar trajectory in terms of Milton's prose writings written over 20 years. But Ambedkar is much more sustained in one particular area, though he also is equally he has written on various issues. And when you read Ambedkar, his various prose writings, at times I'm amazed that he writes so lyrically, right? Though he's not a poet, and he also marshals rhetoric. He quotes Mill, he quotes Carlyle, he quotes every major Western and also the Hindu Shastras and other religious texts. So in terms of scholarship, in terms of the repeated engagement through debate, right, and the kind of flare-ups and dialogues and conflicts that he entered into with Gandhi, right, and not losing the respect for each other, neither Gandhi nor Ambedkar for that matter. So that again, in terms of engaging, there are various points of view. So, but we should be tolerant of each other. At the same time, in a sustained way, agitating for rights, agitating for constitutional rights, right, for everyone. Is certainly remarkable. We need to explore more and not dismiss it in terms of, oh, you can't bring two different divergent, kind of thinkers, but need to look at how repeatedly thinkers, poets, writers, political activists, why do they want to focus on social reform? Why do they want to focus on reform of a particular religious belief, right? And give primacy to the individual to interpret his or her own religion, rather than being imposed upon in terms of a received orthodoxy. We need to engage with this entire set of thought.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think we have one question in the chat box, if I may just read it out to you. I think this question has already been answered, but maybe if we can go beyond. So who can be considered as an Indian counterpart of John Milton, aside of Ambedkar, I'm presuming? Who can be considered as an Indian counterpart of John Milton?
We don't have to compare. We don't have to find, and claim that, oh, we have our own Milton. We perhaps have better. We perhaps have, equally good or bad or whatever. But today's my argument today was primarily in terms of looking at a writer's entire a graph of works, and not limited to a particular genre or a particular text, and look at it in terms of, for instance, if you are looking at Shakespeare, we can't just look only at his tragedies or his comedies. We need to also look at his sonnets, for instance, just as an example, a very flippant example. So similarly here, why do we disregard, why do we not pay enough attention to the prose tracts? If you look at that, then we understand not only our readings of Paradise Lost but also more importantly, that the questions raised in the prose tracts are much more discomforting for us even today. Right? And much more, I would say, it will be a more fruitful engagement if we engage with Areopagitica, if we engage with this Christian doctrine, not as a believing or a non-Christian, but primarily in terms of the possibility of the individual's right to engage, to question authority.
Okay. Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you so much, ma'am, for such an illuminating talk. Since you addressed the question and the motives of John Milton, and as you mentioned that his motive, one of the motives were to talk about the well-being of a common man. So I could immediately think of his sonnet where he writes, the sonnet is titled "How Soon Has Time," and where he talks about the interplay between the youth and time. And since a lot of young minds are here, so maybe you can talk about that a bit, that how this interplay between youth and time, and how we can actually go beyond Milton's Paradise Lost, and maybe, yes, as we can focus on Areopagitica. So I can immediately think of this sonnet. So if you can throw some reflection on the same, that will be great.
The one on the talent?
Yeah, where he writes, how soon has time, on the youth and time, where he talks about the interplay about public achievements and how people look at their achievements, their material achievements, and do not focus on the better and the greater things.
Perhaps not on that sonnet as such, but Milton on and his sonnets. He again changed. How one looks at sonnets, right from the 16th century via Sidney to Shakespeare to Spenser. And then by the time we come to Milton, in the hands of Milton, the sonnet as a form, again, assumed a public, meditative, and also he could talk about, as you said in this sonnet, and also on his blindness, the sonnet on his blindness, he could talk about personal issues, but ultimately he brought it in terms of an engagement with the public weal, so to say. So for him, the individual is not living in an ivory tower. The individual cannot be seen outside the social frame. And when he talks about the society, he brings in the need to look at society not as an abstraction, but as as a commonwealth, as a build-up of individuals. So for him, I think both are equally important. The individual is important, but at the same time, he also is worried about the common good. And when he talks about the common good, he also sees to it that this should not undermine the individual's own freedom and happiness.
Ma'am, we have one more question.
Yes.
In Paradise Lost, we see Adam questioning God. It opens with Satan's perspective on the fall. What is Milton really justifying in Paradise Lost?
Yeah, I know it's a very tough question, and quite often I end up trying to justify Milton. I think we should not do that. This has been again interpreted variously, and I will only share some of the better known interpretations and also how I perhaps look at it. For instance, Christopher Hill, a Marxist critic, very persuasive book, The English Revolution and Milton, he talks about how the events of the 1660 get reflected, in the opening of Paradise Lost, the foul revolt, right, that he talks about in book 9, for instance. And so he says Milton is actually looking at the events of the Commonwealth, the events of the 1640s, and is commenting on that. So therefore, when he says justifying the ways of God to men, he's trying to justify why the Commonwealth movement failed, why the movement against monarchy, why did it fail? Now, this is one way of looking at it, but if you look at it, that cannot be sustained throughout the 12 books, because it does shift, for instance, right from book 3, and even as someone said about, regarding Satan. So he talks about multiple falls, the fall of Satan, then the fall of Eve, and then the fall of Adam, right? So, but in all these, he does make a differentiation between Satan's fall and the fall of Adam and Eve. And he looks at Adam's fall as a choice, right? Because he argues, as in Areopagitica, he also argues in Christian doctrine, and indirectly in Paradise Lost. He talks about how reason is but choosing. Reason is only another name for choice. God has given man reason, so Adam chooses to fall. Right? Now, what Milton is looking at one level when he tries to justify the ways of God, he also is looking at why God allowed man to fall, right? The entire notion of, the entire contestation of foreknowledge, predestination, and free will, right? How do you sustain free will and foreknowledge? And Milton argues, that's why, again, in the Christian doctrine, he argues that foreknowledge does not actually actually prevent or preempt free will. And he says we are not puppets. God might have foreknowledge, but he has given us reason, and we are exercising our choices when we act. And he looks at Adam's fall as a volitional, voluntary act to stand by Eve, and in the name of showing his solidarity with Eve, he desires that he cannot stay without Eve, and he also argues that God might give me another Eve, but I'm in love with this particular Eve, and I don't want that. So the kind of choices that Adam makes, right, when he before he chooses to fall. And so therefore, Milton looks at it in terms of primarily when when the individual decides on behalf of the other, right, on behalf of the community, on behalf of expressing one's solidarity with fellow beings. It is not just about a husband and a wife. It's not just about the first man and the first woman, but in terms of reflecting man as a social being, and one would rather fall with a fellow being than stay on in paradise, right? Stay on in God's company. And he links it to the fact that it is paradise is actually suffocating, and when you come out of it, he towards the end of Paradise Lost, Milton argues that they have actually found a happier far, a paradise, the inner paradise within thee, right? And this notion of the inner paradise is again evolved by Eve, not by Adam primarily. Eve becomes the agency of a kind of a negotiating, right? A peace, truce with Christ, who is pretty angry at them. And then through Eve, Christ promises to be born, etc. We know the myth. He's using that myth. He's accessing that myth from the Genesis to talk about the fall at one level as a felix culpa, as a fortunate fall, and also to highlight primarily the notions of forgiveness, the notion of charity, the notion of forgiveness, the notion of patience as more heroic. Right? So therefore, what Satan says in books 1 and 2 is kind of undermined by Adam's choice, where Satan pulls down 1/3 of the angels, right, along with his fall for his own personal ambition, so to say. Whereas Adam knows that he is going to be thrown out, and yet he chooses to disobey, right? So it's not that when he writes Paradise Lost, he's completely talking only about submission to authority. He also still kind of problematizes that submission, looks at the need to disobey received authority, but the reason has to be substantial. You're not disobeying, but for the sake of it, but you're disobeying because you cannot let your partner, be thrown out. And so therefore it's not solitude, but it is solidarity. This is how I would look at it.
One last question, I think, and then we will have to stop, unfortunately. What are the elements of church that Milton condemned?
Yeah, Milton found the church of his age pretty tyrannical, pretty interfering, and also claiming that the church alone can interpret the Bible. Right? This, despite the Anglican Church, despite the Reformation, the church had begun. The Protestant Church also had begun to arrogate to itself a lot of property, lot of wealth, as well as lot of authority over the individual. And Milton resents this. Milton questions this. And he also says that there is so much tyranny amongst the prelates that they do not let anyone, enter. He actually wanted to be a churchman. He was trained for that, but then he made a choice very early and said that, I do not want to be part of such a church. So therefore, he focuses on reforming the church in terms of, again, the same principles that he targets the monarchy with: concentration of power, hoarding of wealth, and total disregard for the suffering poor. Right. So in a way, he found that church is not Christian enough anymore.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I see there are more questions, but I think we will have to stop here. We have taken too much of ma'am's time. So I would like to now invite Nishita to give the vote of thanks, please.
Honorable Principal, respected Dr. B. Mangalam, and all the guests present here. It's my privilege to give the vote of thanks and conclude this session. I, Nishita Negi, on behalf of English Department of Janki Devi Memorial College, would like to thank our principal, Professor Swati Pal, for always supporting us. A special thanks to Dr. B. Mangalam for sharing our knowledge and views about 19th century England and John Milton with us. A big thanks to Surendra sir and Manoj sir for helping us with the technical aspects of the lecture. I would like to conclude this session by once again thanking Dr. B. Mangalam and all the students and teachers who are present here. We are very grateful for your presence, and it's been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you. Thank you. I tried to answer that in the chat. So I hope the student or the person who asked that on Satan's Rebellion gets it. Just give me a moment to post it. I'm unable to post it.
Yes, ma'am.
This was the okay. I don't know. What does one do? Just press the enter, no?
Yes, ma'am. Generally, just once you type it in the chat box,
I think it's still. No, it's not okay. It's okay. I will perhaps pass it on to you, and you can share it with me.
I'll forward it.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.